Hash chat 4.5 length fixed version ## final rewritten script expanded version. Have you ever wondered what it means to build a second home beneath the first? Not a root cellar, not a pantry, not a place for tools or barrels or the careful storage of turnips, but a hidden room in the earth itself. A place prepared for the night when the cabin above you might no longer be enough. A place made not for comfort, not for pride, but for that severe and ancient purpose that lies beneath so much of human history. The quiet wish to keep the people you love alive until morning. Tonight we are traveling to the Siberian frontier of the 18th and 19th centuries. To settlements so remote that distance itself felt like weather. To winters so deep and so long that the line between patience and endurance became almost impossible to draw. In those northern forests, among bark roofs and log walls and drifts that rose higher than fence posts, early settlers learned a difficult truth. A strong cabin matters, a good fire matters, a tight chimney, dry fuel, careful hands, and a roof checked every autumn will matter. But in the most unforgiving winters, even those things might fail. And because they knew this, because winter had taught it not once but many times, they built hidden shelters under earth and snow. Small rooms where a family could wait while the world above them shook, cracked, drifted over, or simply vanished in white. It sounds dramatic when said quickly, but the reality was quieter than that. It was practical. It was intimate. It was repetitive. It belonged to ordinary people who did not think of themselves as extraordinary, only as careful. And that is what makes the story so suited to a slow night like this. It is not really a story about terror. It is a story about preparation, about redundancy as tenderness, about the very human idea that one shelter is good, but two shelters may save a life. Before we go any farther into the cold, let your own world soften a little. There's no need to brace yourself for this journey. We are not entering the past to be startled by it. We are entering it to feel, as gently as possible, how people made themselves safe in a place where safety was never casual. If you like, you can imagine the room around you dimming slightly, not into darkness, but into that low, thoughtful light in which small objects begin to feel more important than large ones. A blanket, a cup, a chair, a closed door, a warm wall between you and the weather. The people we are visiting would have understood that feeling. They knew how deeply the body responds to enclosure. They knew that a person can calm down simply by moving a little lower, a little inward, a little farther from the wind. That is why the hidden shelter feels so powerful, even before we have seen it. It is a descent, a downward movement toward bark, straw, still air, a small lamp, and the close breathing of other people. A retreat, yes, but not a defeated one, a prepared one, a chosen one. In that sense, the underground room is not only a survival tool. It is an answer to fear made long before fear arrives. The best part of it, perhaps, is that it exists before it is needed. It says to the future, if you come in your harshest form, we have left ourselves somewhere to go. So let that be the rhythm of tonight's story. We will move downward into it, slowly, as those families did. From sky to tree line, from forest to cabin, from cabin to hearth, from hearth to waiting, and at last, when the storm becomes too large for walls, from the world above into the room below, where history itself seems to breathe more softly. There's another reason the hidden winter shelter feels so compelling. It reverses the instinct many of us are taught to trust. When danger comes, we often imagine survival as something taller, brighter, louder, and more visible. Stronger walls, larger buildings, better weapons against the weather. But the families of the Siberian frontier learned that safety could move in the opposite direction. Safer did not always mean bigger. Safer might mean lower, quieter, and more deeply connected to the ground itself. It might mean shrinking your world to one chamber, one lamp, one bundle of dry wood, one skin of water, one patch of straw where a child could sleep without snow falling directly onto their blanket. That reversal has a strangely calming logic. It suggests that human beings did not survive extreme winters by dominating them. They survived by becoming humble enough to fit into the small, protected spaces winter permitted. If you listen carefully, the entire story unfolds from that humility. Not from conquest, but from adjustment. Not from grandeur, but from attention. Not from confidence, but from the careful refusal to trust confidence too far. Imagine the Siberian frontier in deep winter before a storm. The settlement is small enough that every cabin matters, and each cabin is far enough from the next that the distance between neighbors is felt in the body. Not a village pressed close together in mutual warmth, but a sparse arrangement of lives scattered through the taiga, each one built from timber, labor, weather, and compromise. Around the cabins stand forests that seem to continue forever. Dark trunks receding into pale mist, birch and larch and pine, layered so densely that even sound appears to struggle among them. Snow lies deep under the trees, and deeper still in the open spaces where wind has shaped it through repeated storms. Paths exist, but only because they are remembered and reopened. The nearest settlement might be a day's journey in good weather. Longer in bad, and in the worst conditions, the idea of travel disappears entirely. Your world narrows to cabin, shed, woodpile, animal shelter, and the uncertain sky above all of it. The cabin itself is solid by the standards of the place. Green logs cut and lifted by many hands, then set to settle into one another. Moss packed into seams, clay pressed where clay can help, birch bark beneath roof layers to turn away wet, shutters that close tight. A chimney built with more hope than certainty, because every chimney is an argument between smoke and suffocation. The house is good. You know it is good because you helped build it, because you repaired it in autumn, because you have watched it through more than one winter and found it loyal enough. Yet you also know its limits. Everyone here does. A good house in Siberia is not a permanent promise. It is a working arrangement with weather. Even in late summer, people in such places already lived partly inside winter. The forests around them were still green, or beginning to yellow. Rivers still moved openly. Mushrooms could still be gathered. Nets could still be checked in water rather than in ice. Yet every useful gesture of late season had winter attached to it like a hidden shadow. Firewood cut in August was not really for August. Moss gathered and dried in gentler. Weather was not for the day it was picked, but for the gaps. It would stop 3 months later, when the north wind found every weakness in the cabin seams. Hay stacked in broad dry bundles was not just hay. It was future animal heat, future milk, future manure to mix and use, future continuation of a household economy that might otherwise break under the pressure of deep cold. Birch bark stripped carefully and stored flat was not merely bark. It was future dryness, future roof repair, future lining for whatever space beneath the earth might need to remain orderly rather than wet and collapsing. To live on the frontier, then, was to live always in at least 2 seasons at once. You worked in the light while planning for the dark. You cut in warmth for the sake of cold. You stored because winter was not an event ahead of you. It was already present inside every pile of wood, every stitched mitten, every repaired hinge, every sack of grain, every decision about where to set one more roof log before the ground froze too hard for easy change. Autumn was therefore less a beautiful interval than a tightening of the whole settlement into seriousness. The air sharpened, morning stiffened, the first skin of ice appeared in water pails, tools left outside were found rimed white, people moved with greater speed. Not because the days were calmer, but because fewer of them remained. Roofs were checked from one end to the other, not just glanced at, but tested, timbers listened to, snow load imagined in advance, birch bark lifted and reset if it had slipped. Weak patches replaced before the first deep fall made replacement far harder. Chimneys were cleaned thoroughly, because a good winter fire depends as much on smoke leaving the room as on flame staying in it. Doors were rehung if they dragged, shutters were tightened, leather strips were cut to pack around edges that would later admit drafts like knives. Animal shelters were reinforced, stores were counted, then counted again. Families did not ask simply, "Do we have enough?" they asked. Enough if the winter is average, or enough if it is cruel. Enough if one storm traps us for 2 days, or enough if a week of impossible wind keeps us from reaching the farther stack. Enough if one child becomes ill and needs stronger food. Enough if a cow weakens early. Enough if snow arrives heavy before the last cutting is gathered. Survival was not one number. It was layers of margin, and people understood, often with painful intimacy, how quickly margin disappears. The hidden shelter belonged to that autumn seriousness too. In some households it would be reopened, cleared, dried, and inspected before true winter closed the ground. Old straw carried out, new straw brought in, bark checked for rot or displacement, vent shafts traced to be sure they still breathed, a little food rotated, a little wood replaced, water containers tested, lamp oil measured. Some families may even have sat inside the chamber on a cold evening, not because they needed it yet, but because a room must be inhabited once in a while to reveal its faults. The smell of damp where none should be, the place a shoulder strikes the wall when rising too fast. The draft that enters when a vent tunnel is too direct. The way sound behaves in the chamber, and whether one person can still hear another clearly when the hatch is closed. All these things were part of maintenance, though few official records ever bothered to mention them. The people doing such work would not have thought of themselves as performing engineering. They were simply trying not to freeze when the world became unreasonable again. Morning in full winter arrives without brightness. It arrives as a thinning of dark. It arrives in the first pale bloom of breath before your face when you rise from blankets that are warm only where your own body has taught them warm. It arrives in the stiffness of boots kept near the bed so they do not freeze hard in the night. It arrives in the first glance toward the hearth to see whether the embers have survived beneath ash in a way that will save wood, time, and effort. Before anyone speaks, the fire is tended, before breakfast, before animals, before snow, before thought itself has properly formed. The day begins there. You kneel, you stir ash, you find the sleeping red heart of last night's labor. A little dry kindling, a little breath, a little patience, and the room slowly remembers heat. There is something almost ceremonial about that first ignition of morning. Not grand, not religious exactly, but serious. One does not rush it. Wet wood will smoke and choke, poor stacking wastes fuel. Too much too fast can smother the embers just as surely as neglect can kill them. Fire is always a conversation between urgency and restraint, and people who survive harsh winters become fluent in that language. As the flames strengthen, you dress by layers, linen against the skin, if you are fortunate enough to have it. Wool after that, leather, fur, scarves around the face, hands already cold from sleep, tying and fastening things with small, patient movements. The room lightens a little as the fire grows, but not enough to erase the fact that winter lives indoors as well as out. Even with heat, the cabin in deep season is not truly warm by modern standards. It is simply survivable. Outside, the world is blue-gray and nearly soundless at first. The fence posts, if there are fence posts, have almost disappeared beneath snow. The roof line carries yesterday's burden plus last night's addition. The path to the woodpile or animal shelter must be found again. Perhaps it was clear enough before dusk yesterday. It is not clear now. That is winter's quiet skill. It remakes effort overnight. Whatever you completed remains only partially completed. Snow falls, drifts move, wind redraws the yard while you sleep, and morning begins with repetition. This is one reason the hidden shelter belongs so naturally to the broader life of the frontier. The people who built such places already understood that survival depended less on singular grand achievements than on returning, again and again, to the same small tasks with enough patience to keep them from becoming fatal omissions. The path must be opened, the wood carried, the animals fed, the roof checked, the chimney watched, the wet things dried, the dry things protected from damp. This rhythm can seem grim if described too quickly, but lived from within, it also had a strange steadiness to it. There is peace in knowing what the day requires, even when what it requires is difficult. In the far north, uncertainty often came not from the tasks themselves, but from what the weather might add to them. The livestock, if the household is fortunate enough to have any, are drawn close in winter. Chickens in a rough side shelter, perhaps, a goat or cow in a lean-to attached to the house, or built so near that some measure of their body heat and mutual dependence can be folded into human living space. They too belong to the economy of warmth. Their feed was not gathered yesterday. It was gathered in summer, dried under kinder skies, stacked and covered and rationed and worried over through autumn because winter turns every earlier season into stored consequence. A full hay loft is warm in advance. A poor one is cold before the first snow even falls. The same is true of fuel. Firewood carried now was cut months ago, split long before dawns like this, stacked carefully where air could move around it, and wet could not ruin it. Dry wood is future shelter, wet wood is false hope. People in such places understand that all winter comfort begins in summer labor and autumn judgment. You cannot improvise a season's worth of safety in the hour before a storm. The long hours of ordinary winter also train the senses for danger. A family that lives daily with smoke, strain, snow weight, and timber movement learns nuance almost without meaning to. The father who rises before dawn to listen to the chimney in certain winds becomes an instrument for the house. The mother who knows which shutter rattles harmlessly, and which one rattles because the latch has weakened, carries that knowledge in her fingertips. Children learn which roof noises belong to settling snow, and which belong to deeper stress. Even dogs become part of the household's warning system. One can think of the whole cabin in winter as a body made of several bodies, people, animals, flame, wood, bark, leather, all exchanging signals that together determine whether the room remains a room rather than turning into a trap. Storms in those regions were not variations on bad weather as many temperate people imagine them. They were not merely snowfalls with better stories attached. A true Siberian winter storm could alter every scale of life at once. A roof that had carried 3 earlier snows might fail under the 4th if wind and drift packed weight differently. A chimney that breathed well yesterday might gather ice or draw badly when pressure changed. A door that seemed secure might become a wall against itself if snow piled high enough against it from the outside. Trees split in deep cold with sharp reports that sounded like shots. Wind did not sing romantically. It pressed. It poured through seams. It erased tracks. It turned open distance into white blindness. Worst of all, it changed the meaning of time. A short trip from cabin to shed could become impossible. A household could be trapped in place, or driven out of its own home within minutes, depending on how weather chose to combine its elements. People knew this. They spoke of it sometimes, but more often they prepared for it in silence, because repeated warning becomes exhausting unless translated into action. The signs that a serious storm was forming were often quiet ones. The air going still, too still, the clouds flattening low across the sky, as though something heavy were pressing down on them. The sun, if visible at all, becoming a pale disk with no moral authority, only a dim mark in a wide grayness. Dogs growing restless, ravens absent from the branches where they had shouted yesterday. Older neighbors stepping into the yard, looking upward, and saying very little, because what needs doing is already known. You can almost see the settlement enter a different tempo then. Not panic that would waste heat, thought, and strength. Something more disciplined. Roofs are checked, snow load tested, weak places noted, chimneys cleared with bundled twigs and long-handled tools, shutters examined, latches tightened, edges packed with cloth or leather to blunt the pressure of driven snow. Doors are tested not because they failed before, but because one never wants to discover failure while the weather is already on top of the house. Wood is brought inside, more than usual. Emergency bundles are assembled if the family keeps such bundles ready, and most wise families do. Children notice the change in adult movement. They hear less unnecessary conversation. They see the way their mother checks stores twice, the way their father looks toward the tree line without really seeing it anymore, the way the dogs settle badly and rise again. It is in this atmosphere of preparation that the hidden winter shelter becomes visible in the mind, even if the eye does not yet see it. It waits beyond the cabin, or below it, or near a low hillside some steps away, disguised not because secrecy is dramatic, but because survival structures in such landscapes are safer when they merge with the land. Imagine it now in detail, a chamber no bigger than necessity allows, roof supported by logs placed with care, then bark, then packed earth, then snow. A skin of bark against the walls so they do not crumble damply inward, and so the room remains more orderly than raw excavation would permit. Vent tunnels, narrow, angled, hidden where possible, because the earth room must breathe without inviting the storm to live inside it. Straw on the floor, renewed before hard season. Furs folded. A little store of very dry wood, lamp oil, water wrapped to delay freezing. Dried food checked and rotated because supplies prepared for emergencies are only useful if they are kept alive by maintenance. A knife, a pot, fire-starting tools, perhaps a carved object hidden beneath the floor if the family holds such customs. Perhaps a prayer said while laying the bark, perhaps nothing but skill and repetition. Either way, the room is not casual. It is a place built against an event people do not speak of lightly. That already tells us something important. Civilization, even in its smallest frontier forms, often shows itself not in monuments, but in backup plans. The work of maintaining such a shelter has a peculiar emotional quality because it is work against a possibility. On a calm day, the chamber can look almost excessive, a space you hope to leave untouched, a room that asks for labor yet gives no daily comfort in return. That is why younger people sometimes resist its logic. They look at the sound cabin, the stacked wood, the working chimney, and they think one shelter should be enough. They have not yet had the landscape educate them fully. Older people know better. They clear snow from the entrance every few days. They check whether the vent holes remain open. They replace damp straw. They test the hatch. They practice the route at night or in poor visibility until the body remembers what panic would forget. Children are taught too, although often gently, because childhood should hold excitement a little longer if it can. Still, the lesson enters them. If father says go below, you go. If mother hands you a bundle, you do not argue or return for toys or dishes, or blankets you happen to prefer. One does not negotiate with the moment when the first shelter stops being enough. One moves. Families likely rehearse this in different ways. Some would turn the drill into a game for the youngest, counting steps with small mittened hands, letting children feel proud of reaching the hatch quickly. Others handled it almost as liturgy, a repeated order of actions to be memorized by heart. Bundle here, lamp there, younger child first, hatch cover from the inside. Vent check after everyone settles, water placed away from the entry. However it was done, the shelter route became one more pattern folded into domestic life. That, too, is an underappreciated part of the subject. Much of human survival depends not on invention at the moment of crisis, but on rehearsed movement already embedded in ordinary time. As afternoon shortens, the settlement grows dim early. In those latitudes and seasons, evening is often less an event than a surrender of the weak gray light that had passed for day. Lamps are lit, a meal is prepared, if there is still a little emotional energy for ceremony. Thin porridge perhaps, or something thicker if the stores allow. Dried meat, softened, bread. A little hot liquid that warms more by heat than by richness. Families often continue to speak of small things then. Plans for spring, a repaired tool, a trap line, an animal behaving strangely. The habit of ordinary conversation becomes a kind of shield against the mind rushing too soon toward the storm's possible shape. This too belongs in a sleep story. Human beings soothe themselves with routine as much as with blankets. A wife mending by lamplight, a husband checking the fire and pretending not to listen too hard to the stillness outside. Children whispering in a loft, a dog with its head up toward the door. The cabin, for an hour or two, is at once fragile and complete. Above it is the roof that may or may not be enough. Below, somewhere close, is the room prepared in case it is not. The first sound of approaching wind is often not frightening. It is merely different, a breath somewhere beyond the walls. A distant pressure, then the air in the room changes slightly, ears feel it. Flames lean, snow begins to hiss rather than drift. The house answers with its own language of small movements. Timber settling, bracing, learning the force to come. One more log on the fire, one more check of the door bar, one more look at the children, one more glance upward to the loft where the roof cannot yet be seen through darkness. Only heard. This waiting period before a decision is forced may be the hardest part for adults. Action still feels premature. Rest feels impossible. All that remains is listening. That is perhaps why the people of those regions became such good readers of subtle change. When life depends on hearing the wrong note in a familiar structure, the ear becomes almost as important as the eye. Then comes the sound that does not belong, not the creak of wood under normal strain, not the constant speech of wind and snow. Something sharper, raw, specific, a split, a shift, a stress that has crossed some invisible line. In that instant, fear is translated into movement. Children are called. Furs go around the smallest body first. Bundles are taken, nothing more. The fire is left as it is because fire itself is now no longer the center of survival. The door opens inward with effort. Outside, the storm is already more body than weather, a force that steals breath and direction together. Snow drives across the yard in thick white motion. The world loses its edges. There is no long dramatic farewell to the cabin that belongs to fiction more than to frontier life. Real households leave quickly, if they leave at all, because every second spent grieving a room is a second spent exposed. And yet, even so, one can feel the heartbreak of it. To abandon the visible home for the hidden one is to admit that the first line has failed or may fail. That knowledge sits in the chest even while the feet move. The path to the shelter must then be followed not only with eyes, but with memory. Step counts, the feel of packed snow underfoot, a slight rise, a turn by a low buried stump. The body ahead becomes the guide for the body behind. In some families, perhaps a hand stays on a shoulder. In others, a rope is used in the worst weather. Every settlement would adapt. But the principle remains. Practice matters because storms erase landmarks. The hidden hatch, once so familiar, may be invisible beneath fresh accumulation. So the hands go down to snow. They dig by feel. They find wood or packed bark under the powder. The entrance is opened, one by one. Bodies descend. Children first, then whomever must help from below, then the others. At last the cover is drawn back into place, and the sound of the storm changes at once. It does not disappear, but it becomes a more distant thing, filtered through earth, timber, bark, and the small engineering of remembered fear. The lamp is lit. Breath becomes visible in the dim air. Wetness begins to thaw off outer layers. People crouch. Someone begins at once to organize the small space, because that is how adults protect children, by making motion inside the chamber purposeful. The water skin there, the dry wood there, the extra fur around that child. The lamp turned a little, the vent checked, the hatch settled. Now the world is reduced to almost nothing, and yet what remains is enough. A hidden room, bark walls, straw under the knees, furs that smell of smoke and animals and old winters. A small yellow light, human breathing, the muffled storm above. This is one of the most sleep-friendly images in the whole historical record, because it is built from contrast. Above, chaos. Below, containment. Above, force. Below, waiting. Above, drift and breakage and blindness. Below, the narrow but very real possibility of enduring until morning. For adults, the chamber is not comfortable. Air can thicken, bodies crowd, limbs cramp. Water must be guarded. Children may cry or grow feverishly drowsy with exhaustion. Yet the chamber offers what the cabin above can no longer guarantee. A smaller volume to protect, earth that changes temperature more slowly than air, a roof that cannot be blown away because it is part of the ground itself, a darkness that feels, in certain moods, less like fear than like being held. One begins to understand why, in later years, people would speak of such shelters with a mixture of practicality and reverence. A room like this takes the abstract terror of weather and turns it into something measurable. We have bark, we have straw, we have this much dry wood, we have this much lamp oil, we have one another. Sometimes that is enough to quiet the mind more effectively than any promise could. Waiting underground teaches its own rhythm. At first every sound matters. Each gust above seems like a message. Each shift of snow or tree or beam in the storm outside reaches the chamber as a muffled version of itself, and those inside instinctively listen for signs of worsening. But listening cannot continue at such intensity forever. The body tires. Fear, if not fed by fresh disaster, begins to flatten into something more sustainable. A child falls asleep against a mother's side. Someone else closes their eyes, not because they trust the night, but because the chamber is doing what it was built to do. The vent still breathes. The lamp still burns low. The room is crowded but intact, in that transition from acute alertness to exhausted patience. One sees the true emotional core of the hidden shelter. It is not a place of dramatic victory. It is a place where anxiety is slowly converted into endurance. That is a different kind of triumph, and perhaps a more human one. Not a hero standing against the storm, a family huddled together beneath it, waiting out its appetite. The chamber also changes the way people feel time, in the cabin above. Hours are measured by chores, by the need to feed the fire, by the sounds of the world continuing around you, by the little shifts in light through window coverings. Underground, many of those markers vanish. The lamp does not tell you much. The storm is all one sound, or seems so after a while. Bodies create their own small clock. Someone wakes, someone sleeps. A child asks if morning has come. No one knows. Water is shared. A little food is chewed, not because appetite demands it, but because waiting burns energy too. The room becomes almost womb-like in one moment, grave-like in the next, then simply practical again. This emotional instability is part of why hidden shelters attracted not only engineering solutions, but symbolic practices too. When a human being goes underground for hours while the surface world is violently rearranged, the experience invites meanings larger than carpentry. Long before the name Steppan Alexich entered any record, many people must have known in fragments how to do these things. But Steppan gives us one life through which to see the broader current of knowledge. He was born in the middle of the 18th century, into the kind of settlement where children learned quickly that winter was not scenery. It was the great organizer of the year. It determined how much wood had to be cut, how many stores were enough, whether roofs held, whether rivers could be crossed, whether animals lived, whether infants reached spring. He grew up with loss nearby, as so many frontier children did. Siblings or neighbors disappeared into the arithmetic of disease, ice, work, accidents, cold, and hunger. It would be misleading to say such losses were exceptional. Their very ordinariness may have shaped him more deeply than any single dramatic event. The frontier teaches not by one lesson, but by repetition. Yet there was one event, a roof failure in a neighboring home during a bad winter, that seems to have lodged itself in his mind with unusual force. He saw what happens when a family trusts a single structure too completely. He understood, perhaps before he had words for it, that a roof is not a promise, only a probability. His father taught him timbercraft in the practical language of hands and eyes. Grain direction, load, flex, moisture. What kind of wood remembers growth in a way that makes it honest under strain, and what kind turns treacherous and cold? But alongside this settler knowledge came another stream of understanding. His mother had contact, directly or through kin, with indigenous communities farther east, and through her or through neighboring exchanges, Steppan grew up aware that the land itself held older lessons than the cabins did. Snow could shelter as well as bury, bark could line and protect. Earth was not only cold, deep enough below the surface. It was more stable than the murderous air above. Ventilation mattered more than many newcomers understood. Wind could be read from trees. Storm could be guessed from birds and dogs and pressure and sky. These things were not book knowledge, they were frontier literacy. Some of it flowed from Russian settler adaptation, some from Evenki and Yakut traditions, and other Siberian ways of reading climate and ground. By the time Steppan became a young man, those streams had already begun to mix inside him. He built his first hidden refuge early, badly at first, and that badness is part of why his story matters. The first version was too cramped, too poorly vented, too cold at floor level, too dependent on luck. But he tested it. He used storms not only to survive, but to observe. Where did the air turn stale? Where did damp gather? How did the hatch behave when snow packed differently? How long before the room's small virtues began to disappear under the weight of human presence? This willingness to learn from insufficiency, rather than be humiliated by it, may have been his greatest gift. Every better shelter he later built was built not only from material, but from remembered discomfort. There is something almost beautiful in that kind of craft. It does not chase perfection in the abstract. It listens to what hurt and answers it with revision. He also learned from older indigenous hunters and guides, who did not necessarily think of their knowledge as something separate from living. A snowbank was not just a snowbank, it was material. A fallen trunk was not just an obstacle. It could become a roofline or windbreak. Bark was not merely waste from cutting, it was skin that could be laid against damp earth to create order, dryness, and duration. One old man, remembered in later retellings only through Steppan's gratitude, seems to have impressed on him the central lesson that changed everything. The earth itself, when used properly, is warmer than the air in extreme winter. Not warm in an indulgent way, warm in the stern, stable way that makes survival possible. That idea sounds almost simple when heard now, yet it has the force of revelation if you imagine yourself as a young builder raised to trust cabins first and ground second. Once understood, the lesson rearranges an entire mental world. The earth is no longer merely what you stand on or dig into for storage. It becomes a collaborator. When he married Daria, he found in her not romance detached from labor, but partnership shaped by the same weathered realism. Her own family had nearly suffered beyond repair in their first winter after arriving in the region. When a hastily built cabin taught them the difference between looking enclosed and actually surviving, she did not need convincing that hidden precautions were sensible. In their household then, the underground room came first in principle, even when the visible cabin rose above it soon after. Steppan chose the shelter site before the final position of the house. That alone tells us how completely he had rearranged the logic of settlement in his mind. Most people build the home, then think about storage or emergency space. He built with failure already accounted for. That is a radical kind of care. It means admitting from the beginning that good intentions and good carpentry still require backup. Daria's role matters more than summary histories usually allow. A hidden shelter can be designed by one mind, but it is maintained by a household. Straw must be changed, food rotated, lamp oil protected. Children drilled without frightening them into useless panic. Wet furs dried after testing, water containers sealed, the path remembered by everyone. Not just the person most likely to take charge in a crisis. This is domestic labor, in its most consequential form. A shelter below ground is only as good as the ordinary vigilance above it. One can imagine Daria in autumn, kneeling in the chamber, checking a bark seam for damp, counting wrapped food bundles by lamplight, adjusting where a child would lie if the room were crowded. Those acts will never enter a heroic legend, and yet without them no legend would have been possible. This is true of much frontier life. Men may be remembered for building or rescuing. Women often kept the systems alive between emergency. Their children were taught the path to the shelter almost before they were old enough to understand why. Practice in darkness, practice in drifting snow, practice while calm, so that panic would later have a body memory to lean on. To outsiders this might seem severe, but in frontier households severity and tenderness often wore the same face. A mother who insists you memorize the route may be the most loving person in your life. A father who makes you repeat the hatch opening may be trying to spare you a kind of terror you cannot yet imagine. This too belongs to the emotional grammar of hidden shelters. They are made from foresight, and foresight can feel harsh until the hour arrives that proves it merciful. Children likely carried that training into play, counting steps in snow, pretending the drifted mound near the trees was a secret room, arguing over who would carry the lamp or who would crawl in first. Such play should not be romanticized too much, because it grew from real danger. But neither should it be stripped of its ordinary human shape. Children absorb the grammar of survival by turning it into repetition and imitation. That is one more way knowledge lasts, not only through instruction, but through being woven into the textures of growing up. Then came the storm that changed Steppan's place in community memory. It began as many bad storms do, with signs that could still be misread by the young or by the proud. Flat sky, pressed air, animal unease, the sense that the landscape itself had drawn in a breath and not yet released it. But this storm grew into something larger than routine winter trouble. Wind strong enough to tear at roofs and collapse weaker joinery. Snow falling so hard that open spaces disappeared in the time it took to look away. Temperatures dropping into that strange region where speech itself feels wasteful and exposed skin ceases to hurt before it begins to die. Steppan moved his own family into their shelter before the full force of it arrived. That decision alone tells us much about him. He did not wait for visible catastrophe. He trusted pattern, he trusted signs, he trusted preparation more than optimism. Yet the night demanded more from him than his own household's survival. From outside the shelter, through storm noise and packed air, came human voices, or the shape of voices. Neighbors whose cabin had failed, a family lost in whiteout between one probable death and another. The rescue itself need not be told with the sharpness of adventure. What matters is the structure of it. Rope tied, body wrapped, entry into storm, not because he felt fearless, but because the shelter behind him existed and gave his action meaning. One child dragged back, then another, then the adults, one by one, through force that stripped all illusion from the body. Such scenes often become legends because they are easy to dramatize, yet what gave this one lasting power was not heroism alone. It was design. The neighbors lived because the shelter had room enough, because the path had been established, because the rope had been thought of, because the room below was prepared in advance. Even the act of rescue rested on prior maintenance. That is the frontier truth so often buried beneath stories of bravery. Courage without systems saves fewer lives than courage housed inside good preparation. Inside the overloaded chamber that night, every flaw and every strength of the design would have been felt at once. Too many breaths, too little room, too much wet fabric brought in from the storm. A lamp that had to be used sparingly and yet was needed for order. Daria working not with the language of glory, but with the older language of hands. Strip the wet things, rub warmth back, rearrange bodies, steady frightened children. Keep someone talking so silence does not become surrender. These are the hidden mechanics of rescue after the rescue. Bringing a frozen family underground is not the end of the act. It is the beginning of another slower one, the reassembly of life in a room designed for less than what it must now hold. Perhaps that night taught Steppan as much about chamber capacity and post-rescue survival as any dry technical problem ever could. After that storm, hidden shelters ceased to look eccentric in the eyes of many families. The lesson no longer belonged to one man's private concern. It belonged to the settlement itself. People wanted chambers dug, larger ones for multiple families in some cases, better vent shafts, better entrances, better placement. Steppan moved from builder to teacher almost by necessity because the demand outran what one body could dig alone. He trained younger men. He simplified where simplicity improved reliability. He made rough diagrams. He adapted design to soil, slope, drainage, and snow behavior. He probably argued against unnecessary elaboration more often than he argued for innovation, because winter tends to reward the method that works under stress, not the one that impresses in theory. In time, his ideas spread beyond one settlement, and then beyond his name. That is perhaps the deepest kind of success a practical thinker can achieve. The method becomes ordinary. People stop asking who invented it. It simply becomes how sensible households do things. He must also have confronted resistance from those who mistook preparedness for cowardice. Such people appear in nearly every severe environment. The newcomer who believes local caution is superstition. The proud builder who trusts craftsmanship so much that he forgets weather is not an audience to be impressed. The younger man who has survived 2 mild winters and thinks 5 more will behave the same way. Stories of avoidable loss often grow around such figures. Not because communities enjoy moralizing, but because the land makes examples whether anyone wants them or not. Steppan, if the fragments are to be believed, seems to have responded not with anger so much as with weary insistence. Build the second shelter, learn the route, rotate the stores, hope what you like, but do the work. There is something admirable in that refusal to turn survival knowledge into vanity. It remains, always, service. The older he grew, the more his work shifted from digging to listening. That, in fact, may be the most accurate image of his later life. Not a dramatic builder with a spade, but an older man standing in snow, studying a slope, feeling the quality of ground underfoot, watching how drift collects at one line of trees and not another. Choosing a hatch position with the seriousness of someone who has seen what a poor choice costs. Youth supplies force, age supplies pattern recognition. In survival architecture, the second may be more valuable. He knew which chambers held damp, which stayed stable, which suffocated their occupants slowly, which entrances vanished too easily after wind, which roof logs were too ambitious, and which too weak. He knew that a shelter does not need to feel good in autumn. It needs to function in February. That distinction alone can define whether a family emerges from spring with everyone counted. It is worth resting again inside the shelter itself before going farther, because the emotional center of this video does not really belong to Steppan alone. It belongs to the room. Imagine it now, not during the first rushed moments of descent, but several hours later. The lamp has burned lower, the air has steadied, though not become entirely pleasant. Adults have arranged bodies as wisely as possible in too little space. Wet outer layers have been managed as well as they can. A child sleeps, another wakes, cries softly, then sleeps again. Someone shifts straw under a numbed leg, someone sips a little water and passes the vessel on. The storm overhead remains audible, but less personal now. It sounds not like a thing aimed at you, but like a larger world using its strength elsewhere. This shift in perception matters. The chamber does not stop the storm. It changes your relationship to it. You go from exposed participant to sheltered witness. And that change, more than warmth alone, is what the underground room offers. Psychological containment, a boundary, a sense that there is still an inside and an outside. Even when the visible house may already be gone, there were likely many variations in how families endured those hours. Some would keep a low whisper, going so children did not imagine worse than what already was. Others would maintain near silence to conserve air, and because words became tiring. Some might chew dried food slowly to keep the body working. Some might avoid food for a time because the room felt too close for appetite. One adult would almost certainly stay more awake than the others, listening for changes, touching the vent, judging whether the hatch cover had shifted, deciding when to trim the lamp wick. These tiny acts of stewardship in the dark are part of what hidden shelters ask us to notice. History so often praises decisive public acts, but survival frequently depends on private watchfulness, so repetitive and so humble that no record bothers to mark it. That may be why later archaeological traces of these shelters feel so moving. When researchers came upon them generations or centuries later, they often found little to announce their importance at first glance. Depressions in forest floors, circular or oval sags where the ground had settled. Birch bark traces preserved by soil chemistry and darkness. Roof timbers collapsed inward, charcoal organic layering that hinted at straw or furs. The remains did not resemble monuments. They resembled hesitation in the landscape. Places where someone once told the earth to hold a family for a little while. This humility of form is part of their beauty. Grand ruins ask for admiration. These ask for attention. You have to stoop toward them. Imagine bodies in them. Imagine the storm above them. Imagine how such a small room could have mattered more than any fine building elsewhere at that exact hour of use. Some of the excavated shelters proved surprisingly complex. Multi-chamber arrangements, better ventilation than expected. Passages that suggest additions over time. Perhaps one family improved what another began. Perhaps one winter revealed a flaw, and another winter corrected it. Here again, the Earth records revision. Civilization underground was not static. It learned even the simplest hidden room may have had years of error behind its final form, though the final form itself preserves none of the frustration. Just as a smooth sentence hides its rough drafts, a good shelter hides the winters that taught it. Archaeologists walking these reclaimed sites had to learn a gentler kind of reading than they might use at a fortress or cemetery. There were few tall signs, no walls rising chest high, no carved facades announcing function. Instead, there were soft changes in soil, in vegetation, in the way moisture sat in one depression but not another, in the subtle circularity of a place where the forest floor had once been interrupted by human intention. Birch trees might grow differently above old chambers. Moss might sit thicker where earth had settled. The very hiddenness that once protected the shelters now made them difficult to distinguish from ordinary terrain. This feels fitting. They were made to disappear until needed. Even in ruin, they continue the same behavior. And then there are the details that move us from engineering toward mystery. Small stones set into walls in repeated patterns, too deliberate to be chance and too slight to be obvious structure. Carvings buried under floors, wrapped in bark, never meant for display. Tiny ritual fire traces in places where practical heating made little sense. To modern minds trained to separate the useful from the symbolic, these findings are easy to categorize too quickly. Either they were magical thinking or misunderstood technology. But human life at the frontier rarely divided itself so neatly. A person could line a wall with bark because bark resists damp, and also because birch, in many northern traditions, carries meanings of protection and cleansing. A family could place stones in a shelter because someone older swore the room breathed better with them, and also because the act made the chamber feel right. Blessed, accepted by the earth. Practicality and significance are not enemies in such worlds. Often they share the same gesture. The so-called breathing stones remain especially evocative because they sit right at the edge of explanation. Modern experiments may or may not show measurable differences in airflow. Oral memory may or may not preserve fragments of their intended use. Yet even without certainty, the stones tell us that builders noticed the wall as something active, not just a boundary, but a surface where life and earth negotiated. To say a shelter must breathe is already to humanize it a little. It suggests that a good refuge is not dead matter, but something that must remain open enough to exchange with the world without surrendering itself to it. That metaphor alone could have justified the stones in the minds of those who placed them. But metaphor, especially in survival cultures, often lives right beside practical action. The line between symbolic breath and actual air can become very thin when suffocation is one of the dangers a chamber is built to prevent. The idea of going underground itself would have carried more than one layer of feeling. In many cultures, descent into earth is never simply physical. It brushes against ideas of burial, transformation, hiding, rebirth, the womb, the grave, the patient dark from which one emerges changed. A family entering a hidden shelter during a storm might not have spoken in such symbolic terms, but the body recognizes patterns older than doctrine. You go down, you lie low, you wait in darkness while the upper world is remade. Then if all goes well, you emerge into a landscape transformed by weather and silence. It is difficult not to hear echoes of ritual in that, especially in regions where settler Christianity and indigenous Siberian spiritual practices met. Traded gestures, borrowed patterns, and learned to coexist in the very practical business of surviving winter. Priests may have frowned at some customs and adopted others unconsciously. Settlers may have recited Christian prayers while laying stones or bark, according to local advice older than their own family's traditions. The shelter became a place where worldviews met because the storm did not care about theology, only about whether the chamber held. Some families may have crossed themselves before entering. Some may have touched the hatch or the bark wall in ways so habitual they no longer felt symbolic. Some may have placed the smallest child in a particular corner because that corner seemed protected by more than mere draft pattern. We cannot know the full range of such practices, but it would be strange if they did not exist. Human beings invest threshold spaces with meaning. Doorways, graves, cradles, churches, hidden shelters sit at the meeting point of all those associations. A room entered in danger and left in dawn almost asks to be felt as more than a room. This is one reason the subject remains so rich for bedtime history. It is full of ambiguity, but the ambiguity is soft. We are not trying to solve a murder or decode a conspiracy. We are simply sitting near the edge of lost knowledge, aware that some of the most important parts of survival leave only partial traces. A rough sketch of ventilation, a carved object under the floor, the memory among descendants that certain stones helped a chamber breathe. Did they really, perhaps, or perhaps the people who used them, lived in a world where functionality and blessing reinforced one another so fully that separating them now would miss the point? The shelter breathed because it was well built. It also breathed because people believed it should. A family waiting underground does not need modern categories. It needs air, warmth, order, and confidence enough to stay still. If a pattern of stones helped create that confidence, then the stones were part of the shelter's function, whether a modern scientist approves of the mechanism or not. The social life of hidden shelters also reveals something tender and stern about frontier communities. Wealth changed the quality of winter, but it did not cancel winter. A prosperous family might build a larger refuge with better flooring, more supplies, or a more secure hatch. A poorer family might make do with a chamber barely above necessity. Yet storms still compress those differences underground. A nobleman and a poor settler both become mammals trying to hold heat and breath inside a bounded space. Privilege may buy comfort, margin, and better odds. It does not negotiate directly with the storm. That is why practical knowledge from poorer or more locally adapted households often spread upward. Winter, in its own uncompromising way, can make modest expertise more valuable than inherited confidence. At the same time, wealth could lengthen the chain of preparation. More people to cut wood, more animals to provide heat and food, better roofing materials traded from farther places, spare cloth for ceiling shutters, a second or third outbuilding, allowing stores to be diversified rather than all kept in one vulnerable structure. These differences mattered. A wealthy household did not face winter in the same intimate way as a family one failed roof away from catastrophe. Yet that inequality has an odd way of sharpening the hidden shelter's moral meaning. The underground room is one of the few places where rank narrows. If the storm grows large enough, everyone goes low. Everyone crouches, everyone watches air and fuel and closeness. In that sense, the shelter is both a practical room and a social correction. Priests and officials learned this as well. A priest living among scattered cabins could not remain a purely spiritual figure when weather itself behaved like an unending test. He had to understand roofs, food stores, smoke, cold, and sometimes the hidden chamber beneath the floor or near the hill. Some found in that chamber theological resonance, descent before re-emergence, burial before dawn, earth as temporary keeper of light. Others simply accepted the refuge with gratitude. Administrators and military men, when present, often arrived with formulas and assumptions that the land then corrected. A chamber designed from paper but ignorant of drift patterns, soil conditions, and air behavior was a chamber that taught its own lesson very fast. Practical authority in the end belonged to those who had listened long enough to the place itself. And this returns us to Steppan in a way that is less about biography than about character. What made him memorable was not that he invented safety from nothing, but that he listened. He listened to roofs fail. He listened to old people read the weather. He listened to indigenous techniques without dismissing them. He listened to the discomfort of badly designed chambers. He listened to the land until his methods seemed obvious in retrospect. That may be why, in some remembered form, people called him the one who listens to winter. It is a beautiful phrase because it restores humility to survival. Winter is not beaten, it is heard, interpreted, answered. The hidden shelter is not a victory over nature. It is an accommodation made with enough intelligence that nature does not always get the last word. By the time we begin to return from the past, we can see the whole structure more clearly. A visible cabin above, a hidden room below, one for ordinary life, one for the hour when ordinary life fails around them. A whole network of related skills, reading sky, storing food, drying wood, tending fire, placing animals, checking roofs, memorizing paths, lining walls, preserving bark, teaching children, borrowing knowledge, correcting designs, telling stories of failure so that failure becomes less likely next winter. This is not just architecture, it is a culture of redundancy, a culture of refusing to trust one layer with everything. That may sound technical when spoken too quickly, but emotionally it is simple. Human beings loved one another enough to build a second chance into the ground. That culture of redundancy extended beyond shelters. Food was not stored all in one room if it could be helped. Fuel was not all left outside if part of it could be brought inward before a storm. Tools were not all kept in a single exposed shed if some could be tucked near the hearth. The same mind that builds a hidden refuge also learns to think in backups everywhere. 2 bundles of matches, more than 1 water vessel, a spare fur for the smallest child, a neighbor who knows your route, an older son taught the hatch mechanism in case the father's hands fail in panic. Such details may seem minor, but together they define a civilization of caution refined by weather. The hidden shelter is simply the most visible form of a deeper habit of thought. That idea reaches farther than the Siberian frontier. In truth, You are surrounded by descendants of it now. Emergency plans, fire exits, storm cellars, weather warnings, redundant heating systems, insulation codes, backup lights, ways of making the ordinary room less vulnerable by imagining in advance how it might fail. We rarely think of these things as intimate, but they are. Someone somewhere once froze, suffocated, or was buried because the first shelter was treated as final. The safer structures of later ages grow out of those lost lessons. History, in its kindest form, is often nothing more glamorous than improved odds made ordinary. Modern rooms hide their redundancies more elegantly, but they hide them all the same. The insulation in the wall, the weather seal around a window, the forecast on a screen, the extra blanket folded nearby, the emergency number memorized without reverence, the way a city can announce incoming danger before the first snowflake arrives. None of this feels heroic, because that is precisely the goal. Good protective systems disappear into normal life. People only notice them when they fail. The frontier families of Siberia would have understood this perfectly. Their dream was not to think about the hidden chamber all the time. Their dream was to know it existed, and then not need it. Safety, at its best, is boring. It permits ordinary sleep, so as we let the frontier drift away, return slowly to the room you are in now. Let it appear not just as a room, but as shelter, the soft mist beneath you, the steadiness of your walls, the ease of warm air moving around you. The fact that tonight you do not need to count steps through a whiteout to a hatch beneath the snow. The fact that if the weather turns, you probably have warnings hours or days in advance. The fact that the hidden systems around you, the insulation, the planning, the architecture, the emergency norms, all exist because long before you, people studied danger, until danger became procedure. That is what Steppan and those nameless frontier families gave the future. Not drama for its own sake, better habits, better design, better rest, and perhaps that is the best final image to sleep with. Not the storm itself, not the cracking roof, not even the hurried descent, but the room below after the hatch is closed, bark against earth. Straw laid carefully, a lamp in the dark, the sound of wind made distant by good planning. A child already asleep because someone else prepared this place in time. Above, the whole white world can rage and rearrange itself. Below, life narrows, slows, and remains. The hidden winter shelter is a small thing by the standards of empire or architecture or grand historical memory. Yet for the people who needed it, it was everything. A little chamber of foresight, a pocket of second chances, a room where fear could become waiting, and waiting could become mourning. Let that image soften now. Let the hatch settle closed in memory. Let the snow above it thicken. Let the lamp burn lower. Let the family breathe more slowly. Let the forest stand around them in the long, patient dark. And let yourself rest in the simple knowledge that history is full of people who prepared, carefully, and without applause, so that someone later could sleep more safely than they did. You can stay with that image a moment longer if you like. The chamber is quiet now, not perfectly quiet, because perfect quiet rarely exists where human beings and weather meet, but quiet enough. The vent still gives a thin passage for air. The lamp is almost at its softest point. The straw has flattened beneath the weight of a long night. Furs have absorbed smoke, breath, damp, and the warmth of bodies staying close, because closeness is the oldest winter skill. No one is speaking now. They have said the things that could be said. They have checked the things that can still be checked. All that remains is trust in the work already done. That feeling, the feeling of lying inside completed preparation, may be one of the rarest and most profound forms of peace human beings know. It is different from luxury. Luxury often asks for more. This asks for less movement, less doubt, less exposure, just enough shelter, just enough air, just enough heat, just enough patience, and one more night survive. The storm can remain in the past tonight. The hidden path can vanish again under fresh snow. The old bark-lined chambers can sink farther into the earth, and the memory of the people who built them can blur, as memories do, into the broader shape of care. Yet the logic remains: build a visible home, tend the fire, watch the sky, and when the world proves harsher than the first shelter can bear, know where the second one waits. That old wisdom crosses the centuries very softly. It reaches you not as a command, but as a feeling, the feeling of being enclosed, of not having to face the weather directly tonight, of lying inside layers of inherited thought, of being, in ways large and small, protected by people who listen to winter so closely that you no longer have to. So rest now in that long afterglow. The roof above you is enough. The walls are enough. The night may deepen if it wishes. Somewhere beneath the oldest stories, hidden still, there is always another room, prepared in love before the storm arrives. And because of that, you can let your thoughts go dark, and lower, and quieter, and drift all the way down into sleep. If you imagine the morning after, imagine it gently. The storm has spent itself somewhere beyond the tree line. The hatch opens with effort. Light enters not brightly, but with the pale, exhausted quality of winter daylight after violence. Snow lies remade across the landscape. Drifts stand where the yard once was. Familiar lines are hidden. The cabin above may be standing, or broken, or half buried, but the family emerging from the earth does so breathing. They rise stiffly, they look around, they count one another, they begin again. That too is part of the shelter's meaning. It does not end the story, it returns the story to life, and perhaps there is no better blessing than that, not victory in any grand sense. Only enough survival to start once more, so let the final feeling be not fear, but gratitude. Gratitude for every unknown hand that cut bark, stacked wood, memorized routes, changed straw, checked vents, and believed that the people beside them were worth preparing for in advance. Gratitude for the builders who noticed failure and did not call it fate. Gratitude for the mothers who kept the emergency bundles ready. Gratitude for the fathers who listened to roofs and sky. Gratitude for children who learned the path by heart and later taught it to children of their own. Gratitude for old knowledge passed quietly from one winter to the next until it became so normal no one remembered when it was new. That is how history most often helps us, quietly, repeatedly, without asking to be admired. It simply makes the next night a little safer than the last. And now there is nothing left to do but rest. The chamber beneath the snow can close again in memory. The taiga can grow still. The lamp can go lower and lower until it is hardly more than a warm thought in the dark. The people in the shelter can sleep because the hatch is shut, the bark holds, the vent breathes, and the earth itself has agreed for this one night to keep them. You too can let the night keep you now. There is no roof to check, no drift to clear, no hidden path to memorize before morning. Others already carried those tasks across the centuries. Others already listened to winter for you, and because they did, you can remain exactly where you are, surrounded by your own quiet walls, held by your own modern shelter, and drift very slowly, very safely, all the way down into sleep.